The three of us, myself, Professor Akon Fung, and Professor Tariq Masood, are from the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. And in our center, which I think now is the largest research center at the Kennedy School, we focus on a number of things. As the name might suggest, we focus on work around government innovation. And for some 20 plus years, we've overseen the Innovations in American Governance Awards program, which we've also built sister programs in different countries around the world, and that is an ongoing set of activities. We're expanding some of that work into working with local communities here to provide opportunities for students. And we're working very closely with who you'll have seen on a couple of occasions yesterday, Mayor Curtatone, to develop a set of other activities following up from what he'd been doing with Linda Vilmers. Secondly, as the other part of the name suggests, we also are looking at issues to deal with democracy. And one of the things we've been developing over these 2 years is what we've called 10 challenges to democracy. And that's because it's the 10th anniversary since the center was renamed as the Ash Center. And that's a series of activities, talks, outreach, research. We partnered with WBUR Broadcasting. We partnered with the ART here. We partnered with the Harvard Film Archive for a number of events. And that, in a sense, is looking at the questions of challenges in what one might call mature democracies. But also 2/3 of what we'll be talking about in this presentation from us this afternoon is related to what we call democracy in hard places. And as I'm sure Tariq will explain subsequently, Egypt is one of those hard places. But we're also doing a lot of work in Asia, including transitioning democracies, Indonesia, Myanmar. We have long-standing programs in China and also in Vietnam. So I will start off first making some comments about how I see the situation related to China. Tariq will then talk about Egypt, and then Archon, probably more optimistically, will talk about, well, maybe, you haven't seen how pessimistic we might be, but more optimistically about potential developments in the US. So, any political system that relies heavily on ideological diktat and control over language and discourse inevitably is going to open itself up to cynicism and parody. And as in the former Soviet Union, I guess you've seen the copies of the Big Red Joke Book and so on and so forth, China is no exception, where people like to play with the language, play with the terms. And for example, just after the global financial crisis, one of the student jokes that did the round was 1949 when they took power, only socialism can save China. By 1979, as the reforms started, only capitalism can save China. 1989, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, only China can save socialism. And then, of course, with the global financial crisis, only China can save capitalism. And of course, this jokes has also gone into discussions online. What we see here, this is Christian Bale. And as you may know, Christian Bale went to film part of the Batman movie in China. And I guess one of his advisors said, look, to escape criticism about human rights issues in China, you really should do something. So he chose to go and visit the blind lawyer who was being held under house arrest for helping people about dealing with the process of forced abortions in this town. And he was stopped by this gentleman here, who is a local guard. This man then became an internet sensation. So he turned up, for example, online with the Batman poster. He then turned up with a very famous dissident artist. He's into modern art, clearly, Ai Weiwei, overseeing what he was doing on behalf of the party. He's clearly a powerfully political figure. He turned up with the former president of China to give him a little bit of advice. But he's also an international figure, and he clearly helped with the transition in North Korea that was taking place. And then, of course, he always wants to keep an eye on what the US might be doing and how that would impact on the relationship. So joking clearly goes around in the system, it rolls around. As I said, a system that sets it up based on language as a core part of legitimacy is always going to leave itself open to this kind of joking. But are there more serious issues that social media have been dealing with? Well, let me just give 3 quick examples. This person became very famous, known as Wristwatch Brother. And if you go now and you meet a Chinese official, you will see that the cuffs on their shirts are pulled down very much over their wrists. Because what was happening was the citizens were taking photos of officials who had very low salaries but extremely expensive watches and were putting them online. And this led eventually to this man losing his job. So it was a part of the corruption watch that the government seemed to be encouraging with this. It also had other serious issues. The big rail crash in Wenzhou was initially tried to be covered up by the Chinese government. Not that there'd been a rail crash, but the extent of it. They wanted the carriages buried, they wanted it quickly hushed up, they told the media they should not be reporting it. Again, it was exposed by social media. One of the earliest examples of this was when SARS broke out in China, 2002, 2003. And again, you had this continual process of the government trying to cover up the extent and the seriousness of SARS, but mobile technology essentially letting people know there really was a big problem. There was something I think was tweeted 175 million times around Guangdong in the south of China within the space of 48 hours saying there is a virus in China and it is killing people, at a time when the Chinese government were denying there was any problem. And so we see people taking care, and even dear old Chairman Mao got very worried about the potential for the spread of SARS. So we have online jokes, we have it then shifting into social commentary, attacking bad practices, or trying to open up the system to more news and more information that might be going. But then the question becomes, is there a challenge that moves beyond this incident-based phenomenon into a protest or something that provides more of a systemic threat? And I think here the picture becomes more muddied and more complex. I think the initial euphoria was that new social media would undermine authoritarian systems, it would democratize politics, and it would open up new social space for citizen participation. But I think the picture that actually is emerging is much more nuanced than that. And that the Chinese regime, in fact, is adjusting much more effectively than the early prognosis suggests. Now, certainly, the advent of the information revolution and the need for information that is delivered reliably, that is also delivered at high speed, does provide a major challenge for governance. And it does, of course, offer new channels for representation, as the previous slides showed. If nothing else, it fundamentally conflicts with the party's traditional manner of representation. There's always been a long tradition of managing information flows to ensure that the party is the primary, if not sole, provider of information. And the Chinese Communist Party tries to channel information flows vertically, and it tries to cut off the horizontal flow of information across society. So this means actually information, more than many other systems, is power. So essentially, the way information is controlled in the Chinese system is a very important basis for power. And the ability to provide the correct information or the correct interpretation of the past, of course, provides legitimacy to decide on current policy. And what is really traded in China is secrets, and it's access to information. That's the real good of value in China. So things that cut across horizontally or spread this information very quickly become an extraordinarily strong challenge. But it's becoming increasingly dynamic. Just even 5 years ago, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences ran a survey in which they showed that together with cell phones, the internet had now become the most powerful carrier of public opinion. So what the party has tried to do is treat this new media in the same way as traditional media. It's tried to organize it, it's tried to make it cellular, it's tried to make it range vertically up and down the system. And in addition to legislation to control this kind of new media, the party also pay its online commentators. And this is what is sometimes seen as they're referred to as the 50 cents party. And it's 50 cents because they're paid 50 Chinese cents for each comment they put online, which is in a pro-Chinese Communist Party vein. I don't have to go in time why there's alpaca on this, but this actually relates to another fun game that Chinese netizens played at this time. So the party then is right to be concerned, as various events have shown, that new media is emerging to support new forms of political activism and has mobilized citizens in ways that can impact on policy. As you've all heard, with the introduction of Weibo with its microblogs, just 2 years after its introduction, it already had 250 million users. And in fact, in a survey that we conducted in 2011, 63% of those we polled felt that it was the most reliable source of information. So if you're relying on tweets, basically, as your sole or your most important information source, that has a dramatic impact on the traditional systems. So it's not surprising then that the new leadership has moved to blunt the impact of Weibo through new regulations and forced a number of high-profile tweeters to drop their blogs. There was an interesting survey a little while ago by the British Daily Telegraph that showed that it reached a peak before March 2012, and then they required all users of Weibo to register with their real name. The Telegraph then feels there was a 70% drop in usage once you had to register with your new name. Weibo claimed it was still expanding, not surprisingly, but it did wipe 500 million off its shares as a result of this drop in use. What has happened is, I don't know if anybody here uses WhatsApp. Good. Yeah, some of you are young enough, yeah, I guess it's right. Well, Chinese has a similar thing called Tencent WeChat. And that's really begun to take over. As Weibo has closed down, WeChat has begun to take off. The importance, though, for the regime's purposes, is that WeChat is a private system. Weibo is a public system and entirely open. So something can go immediately viral if you put it up on Weibo. With WeChat, it's contained because you have to friend people and you have to exchange. So it can spread, but it spreads much more quickly. So the regime has essentially tolerated people shifting over from this one system to another. So online communities have also influenced policy. We've seen the netizens with the anti-Japanese claims, the anti-American campaigns, and that indeed, I think, has pushed the government to take more nationalistic stances in a number of places. So, as I said, there's been a raft of measures introduced to control social media. They've also to provide essentially a legal basis for the detention and arrest of critical or dissenting voices. So to conclude, I think that the rise of virtual communities that transcend these traditional jurisdictions and even sovereign boundaries is difficult for China's current leaders, which are essentially a Soviet-trained generation, to contemplate. It's far removed from their notions of modernity, where planning, heavy industry, and electricity represented progress. And I think treating citizens as children who need to be spoon-fed information and hear only good news is really no longer viable when you're dealing with essentially a globally wired middle class. So I think for the new leadership, which has just taken over, this is going to be one of the major challenges and things to look at, is are they going to stay trying to control social media within this traditional framework that they've always used, or are they going to try and find new ways to deal with the technology? So last, what has been the response of the online activist media community? What do they think about the recent controls? I think the answer is pretty clear. Thank you. Eric?
Great. Thank you, Tony. Always a tough act to follow. I will note that Tony is wearing a very expensive Swiss watch. Can I also just, can we have some water? There's only one glass, and I may peter out in the middle of this talk. Okay, so I've been asked to talk about social media in Egypt. I think folks have. Oh, can you hear me without the mic, or
Maybe turn it on.
I'll turn it on. Yeah. Oh, can you hear me better? Maybe you can hear me better now. So I've been asked to talk about social media in Egypt. Egypt is the country that I study most closely. And if you've been engaging with Middle Eastern politics over the last 3 years, probably the image that you have in your mind of places like Egypt or Tunisia is of these, photogenic young people achieving success in revolutionary actions to unseat long-standing dictators. And for the longest time, this was so surprising. This was very surprising to anybody who studied the Middle East, because the Middle East for us had become basically the poster child, not just for authoritarian government, but for a particular kind of authoritarian government that was thought to be really durable, right? We coined a name for it, durable authoritarianism, and we wrote books and articles explaining how these dictators had really mastered the art of dominating their populations. And so it was totally surprising to us that the population stopped playing along with this game. And so very quickly we started looking for explanations. Why was it that Egyptians in 2011, Tunisians in 2011, Yemenis, Libyans were able to overthrow their dictators? And very quickly we settled on the answer that it was this guy, right? Great product of Harvard, I'm a non-graduate. But basically the argument that we often heard was that these were Twitter and Facebook revolutions that were made possible by information technology. That information technology did two things. First, it lowered the costs of collective action, right? So acting collectively in these places was thought to be very hard, even harder than ordinarily, right? One of the odd things about my discipline, political science, is that we should almost never see collective action, given our dominant theories. But the point is, it was thought to be particularly difficult in authoritarian regimes where you would suffer bodily injury if you tried to engage in collective action. But the argument was that, well, it became easier to coordinate collective action because now instead of having to build face-to-face networks, you could post a tweet or post something on Facebook and say, everybody be in such and such place in such and such time, and somehow that made it easier for people to actually show up at such and such place in such and such time. The second way in which we thought social media really mattered for creating these uprisings was in that it allowed people to gain information about their regimes. So the idea here is that people were laboring under something called the fundamental attribution error. So I'm living in authoritarian Egypt, my life is kind of crummy, and I ascribe the crumminess of my life not to the regime, right, but to my own qualities, right? Oh, I didn't work hard enough, I'm sort of not good looking, this is why my life sucks. Not because I live under this hugely corrupt regime. Well, what this social media is thought to have done is to allow people to exchange information about their experiences with this regime, to allow people to garner new information about the corruption and sins of these regimes, and therefore to overcome the fundamental attribution error, to understand that their misfortune in life would not be alleviated until they acted collectively to overthrow the regime. And oh, hey, here's a tweet, and it says to be in such and such place at such and such time. So this is actually not a new idea. In fact, we can look at revolutions throughout history, and we often find that the revolution is ascribed to some new technology. Okay, so these are some remarks from President George H.W. Bush at the National Academy of Sciences in 1990 after the dramatic events in Eastern Europe. And Bush ascribes that revolution to the fax machine and satellite television, which allowed both coordination of collective action and people to gain new information about their regimes. Right? So this idea of ascribing revolution to technology is pretty long-standing and entrenched. So what we try to do is we try to actually assess this empirically. And so I've got a project supported by the Ash Center with a colleague at MIT, and what we've been doing is we've been going through tweets and trying to see if we can identify protests in Egypt solely by looking at tweet volume. So we know, for example, if there's a protest among workers in a particular area in the Nile Delta, can we see in advance of this protest or during the protest a higher than average tweet volume in that location, right? That would give some suggestive evidence that in fact there's a link between social media and protests. And what we find so far is that we can't do it. So this is from a day in April, and where we know some protests happened, and we identify some points that are higher than average tweet volume, and they're not. These are just geolocated tweets, so people who have their cell phone GPSs on. And we basically find that, one of these is a guy who's tweeting to his girlfriend. Another is, lots of people getting really excited about Arab Idol, which is like the Arab version of American Idol. But it's actually kind of hard to correlate these with protests. But this is still an early project. One of the reasons, though, that this shouldn't surprise us, right? It shouldn't surprise us that we don't really see this nice tight correlation between tweeting and political activism is because internet access in Egypt is pretty low anyways. Right? So these are results from 2 surveys that I did with colleagues. One we did in December 2011, and we asked people, do you use the internet to access and exchange information on national and local issues? Only 191 of 1,675 people said yes. Okay, so we're talking about 11% of the sample. In November 2013, how often do you use the internet? 82% of people, never. I never use the internet. So the idea that these mass movements against regimes are somehow made possible by something with very little penetration seems a little bit difficult. I see 2 hands, right? I'm not going to take questions. So this is from, this is some data that I didn't collect. It's from the World Values Survey. So the World Values Survey asks the same question. How often do you use the internet? And the red line is people who say never, and the blue line is people who say daily, right? Egypt, again, consistent with what we found in our surveys, is pretty high never, pretty low usually, right? This is Algeria, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Libya, Qatar, Tunisia, right, about 35%. Yemen, very low internet penetration, internet usage. What do we notice from this slide? Well, the places that have the highest internet penetration actually did not witness regime change. Right? They did not really witness regime-challenging protests. In fact, if we were to identify a correlation between internet penetration and protests, we would actually find, I think, a negative correlation. Right? A place like Yemen, Tunisia is a sort of middle-level place, but the places that have really high usage, we didn't see anything. So what does this mean? Well, part of what it means and part of the impact or the implications of this were pretty clear in the aftermath of the revolution in Egypt. In Egypt, this is a guy named Wael Ghanem, who you've probably heard about. He was a Google marketing executive who was responsible for maintaining one of the Facebook pages that was a virtual organizing center, or thought to be a virtual organizing center of the revolution. It's called All of Us Are Khaled Saeed. And if you read, there was a New York Times story about President Obama and his decision-making during the Arab Spring. And in this story, it's reported that somebody asked the president, what do you want to see happen in Egypt? And he said, I want the kids on the street to win and the Google guy to become president. This is the guy. And of course, if you know what happened in Egypt, you know that that was a pretty naive hope, right? Because very quickly, the possessors or the users of these newfangled information technologies were brushed aside by those who used much older, tried and tested technologies, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, which uses the technology of the mosque, right? 1,000-year-old technology for reaching out to people and engaging in face-to-face communication with them. And then, of course, the military, which has an even more tested technology, which is called the gun. And so the idea here is that why did this happen, right? Why was it that these information technologies didn't really allow these protesters to actually inherit the post-revolutionary period, given that they are thought to have made that post-revolutionary period? And for me, at least, this causes me to come back to structural factors, right? So I believe that it's not virtual networks that matter, it's real networks that matter. The Muslim Brotherhood was able to dominate politics in Egypt after the revolution because they had a long-standing network built over the course of more than 80 years, which drew in mosques, religious charities, their own fairly strong and well-organized political party to allow them to organize electorally. Right? The military, as we know, has been dominating Egypt for the better part of 60 years. Their real bricks and mortar networks are not in question. And we find that for non-Islamists to have been able to stand up to the military and to stand up to the Muslim Brotherhood, they would have needed to have their own real face-to-face networks. Things that are rooted in, for example, labor unions or non-religious charities, real forms of non-religious, non-state civil society. And these are really weak in Egypt. Egypt is a pretty poor country, right? So if you look at this is per capita income in 2005 constant dollars. We have this sort of magic threshold, by the way, at which we think democracy is durable. That's the per capita income of Argentina in 1976. That's because Argentina in 76 was the richest democracy ever to have failed. Egypt is way below that. Most of these Arab countries are way below it. And the ones that are way above it tend to be oil-rich countries, which, their wealth actually helps them maintain authoritarianism. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because poor countries tend not to have very highly developed civil societies outside of the realm of religion and the family, right? Poor, underdeveloped agrarian societies tend not to have this kind of strong labor unions, for example, that could be the bulwark of progressive leftist politics in these kinds of countries. This is just a really rough attempt to try to show this, where basically I got this database from the Egyptian Ministry of Social Affairs and coded NGOs. There are like 17,000 NGOs in Egypt, and we code them based on whether they're Islamic or whether they're based on employment. And the bottom line is that the vast majority of NGOs in this country are based on a religion, right? And very few are based on things other than religion. So it's not surprising, right, that the non-religious actors were not able to stand up either to the Muslim Brotherhood in elections or are able to stand up to the military now. So if there's one sort of headline you take away from this, it's that yes, social networks matter, but they have to be real ones and not virtual ones. Okay, thank you.
Somebody switch.
I got it.
Great.
1 second. And there you
Great.
go.
Thank you very much. So we talked about China, Egypt, and now we're going to talk a little bit about the United States. And I wanted to scope back a little bit, and I'm just beginning to think about how digital technology interacts with politics. And I think the main kind of contribution of my remarks is to give you some different ways to think about how technology interacts with politics. And it's really nice because I think I'll be able to tie together some of Tony's remarks and Tarek's remarks in thinking about this. I first started thinking about this subject because every semester about 10 or 15 students come into my office and say, I've got a great startup idea that will save democracy. And I think 2 of them have been good so far. And so I think that Kennedy School is really falling down on its job of at least giving our students some basic sensibilities about what counts as a good idea and a bad idea in this space. And so that's kind of how I got started thinking about this a little bit. I take my inspiration, as people who know me know that in many areas of my life, I take a lot of inspiration from the late Steve Jobs. And this area is no different. Steve Jobs said that the distinctive thing about Apple Computer is that it operates right at the intersection of technology and the liberal arts, right? And there's a lot of great technology companies, but they don't get it. They don't get people. They get computers, but they don't get people. And I think that the contribution of the Kennedy School in this regard is to operate right at the intersection between politics and technology. And that's what Tony and Tarek have done in their remarks so far, is take technology seriously on one hand, but think about how it interacts or doesn't interact with real worlds of politics and political organizations. And for those of you into the technology space, you will recognize that this is very unusual, I think, in technology discussions. Many people in technology discussions are very versed in the technological aspects, but quite naive, I think, about the realities of political organization and progress in this space will come, if it comes, because people have one leg squarely planted in both worlds. And so how do you think about this space right at the intersection of technology and politics? And I want to begin by offering a model, a very simple model that doesn't quite fit China or Egypt, but does fit the United States, of politics in a democratic space. And basically the idea is that you have citizens. What they do is they talk with one another and with media organizations, and sometimes they operate through organizations like interest groups and political parties. And through those conversations, they select elected officials and pressure government to make laws and policies to take public action. And that's kind of a very simple model of democratic politics without technology. And now, basically for the main part of my remarks, what I want to do is think about how this model changes when you introduce digital technology into the picture. And people have very different ideas about how it changes. And I think 3 of those ideas that are very popular are mistaken, and I'll show you why. And then 3 of them that are a little bit less ambitious but still hopeful have more promise. The first idea is that technology, digital technology, makes organizations irrelevant, because what it does is enable people to act collectively just through each other without organizations, by interacting through social media or other means. And my friend Clay Shirky and other people have made this argument that what technology does is make organizations irrelevant. And so what it does to the old model is that citizens don't really need much government or much traditional organization anymore, because they interact with each other to do things and take public action. And so kind of Clay opens up his book, Here Comes Everybody, with this example of a girl who loses a sidekick, a company that went out of business a long time ago, but they made smart devices. Instead of going to the police, she uses social media to say, I lost my sidekick. All of her friends kind of get together. They find the person who took her sidekick, get the sidekick back, and they completely vilify this person, and horrible things happen to them afterwards. But they accomplish all of this without any traditional organization or government, but simply through ICT. And Clay kind of generalizes from that and says, well, we don't need organizations anymore. I think for people going to a school of government, it's pretty easy to see why that path is not quite right? Because a lot of public action is not about just moving information around, but about moving bricks and mortar and people and money and all sorts of things around that you do need real organization for. Now, in the early days of technology, digital technology, the people offered another model of why digital technology would be revolutionary. And that model was that it would really make the public sphere of discussion and public conversation much more open and democratic and flat. And that's because with digital technology, anybody can put up a blog. Probably a lot of the people in this room have put up a blog or interacted with social media. And the idea is that what digital technology would do was make everybody a broadcaster instead of locking up information in the United States and just 3 big media companies. It would be 100 million or 200 million people would get to broadcast their own information. That would be very good for democracy. As Tony said, that happened for a little while in the Chinese context, but these guys came back and said, okay, we got to control that space, right? In the US context, I think the reality of the last 10 years has made people much more skeptical of this idea. It's not that ICT hasn't transformed the digital space, but it hasn't made it all that much better for democracy, it seems like, right? So this idea that everybody as a broadcaster turns out to be wrong. So if you look at the 10 most popular political commentators on the internet and look at their resumes, they're more elite than the regular columnists of the New York Times, right? So the internet doesn't level in that regard. It focuses eyeballs, but it may create an even worse winner-take-all society. Another problem that with this model that's detailed in Eli Pariser, one of the founder of MoveOn's book, The Filter Bubble, is that one of the things that technology does, arguably, is drive us into different ideological corners. Cass Sunstein also made this argument with Republic.com. Eli Pariser kind of argues that it's in large part because of internet companies like Facebook and Google. Part of how they make money is they give us results that we want to hear, right? And so if I search for Barack Obama on Google, I get one set of results. if my pretty conservative father-in-law searches for Barack Obama on Google, he gets a very different set of results, because Google knows what his political preferences are and my political preferences. As a matter of fact, Google may know that better than I myself. So that model's not quite right. A third model, which a lot of people at the Kennedy School do kind of glom onto and hold out hope for, is that digital technologies will really improve the quality of democracy by creating a direct connection between citizens and politicians and public agencies, right? It'll take out the kind of mediation of traditional organizations and allow a kind of direct interaction. And I think that's in part, that is possible, but we don't really see much of that happening yet in the United States. And I don't think it's a technology problem, but it's a political incentive problem. So a little thought experiment, or real experiment. After this talk, kind of get on your web browser and go to the website of your, if you're in the United States, your congressman, one of your political representatives, and try to contact them through that website. And what you'll find is that you probably can contact them, but it'll be through this little form with a drop-down menu, and maybe you'll put in your email address and category of problem and be able to write a sentence to them. It's actually much less satisfying even than email, right? And anybody, I don't know how many coders there are in this room, but anybody who has any computer science skills could very easily, in a couple of hours, put together a technology interface that is much thicker and more satisfying than what you see basically in every member of Congress's website, right? And so that tells me it's not a political problem that's making that a bad, or not a technology problem that's making that a bad interface. It's that it's a political problem. They don't want to interact with you digitally in that way, right? It's an intentionally narrow channel of interaction, not a technologically determined narrow channel of action. So I think that's not quite right, the right picture, this picture of citizens interacting directly with public agencies. Skip that part because it's about Brazil. Now the upshot of the first three failures, I think, is that organizations still remain the linchpin of politics even in a digital era. And so it's very important to think about how ICT interacts with organizations in the political domain. And here are three more modest models of how technology has the potential to increase the quality of democratic politics that I think are more realistic. The first model is what I'm calling truth-based advocacy. And this is the potential of digital technology to bring much more data out to the public for people to consider, make decisions, and hold organizations, both public organizations and private organizations, accountable. This is not an easy road, but nevertheless, I think more promising than some of the ones that I showed you before. One example of this recently comes with all of the disclosures and transparency in the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, right? And the stimulus package, as is better known, invested billions and billions of dollars in infrastructure, and every single contract that was let was available for people to inspect on the internet in terms of dollars. And it's not that ordinary citizens use that information, that would be asking a lot, far too much, but it was a rich source of data for accountability and monitoring for two other sets of organizational actors. One is professional journalists, but the second is people in the bureaucracy, in state-level bureaucracies, who found this information very, very useful in holding their contractors accountable, and in the journalist case, holding government more broadly accountable to making sure that the ARA money was used responsibly. And partially as a result of this, in addition to top-down kind of auditing, there are very, very few corruption cases in the stimulus package, which is kind of remarkable given how much money was at stake. Very few discovered corruption cases. We don't know what the undiscovered level is because it's undiscovered. Now, a second model of how digital technology enables a little bit better democratic politics is that it enables each of us to become a monitor of our political and social conditions, right? And so the idea here is that just like Amazon ratings and Netflix ratings and TripAdvisor, all these consumer applications allow people to monitor the quality of products or books or movies or vacations and make that public information so that we can gain individual benefits. Technology potentially allows those kinds of dynamics for public problems as well. We haven't seen too many of those yet, just a few, but they're starting to appear a little bit in healthcare and especially in local government. And some people may be familiar with SeeClickFix, which is an early example in the United States, in US cities of this kind of example. And this is basically using technology, the internet, and mobile devices as devices to monitor and report problems in cities, and so that city governments can track those and respond to them more quickly. The first one of these was originated, the first big one was in the UK around all UK localities. The third example, or the third kind of interaction between technology and politics, which I think we'll see a lot of in the future, is political mobilization, is the ways in which digital technology is allowing traditional organizations to connect more quickly and more effectively with citizens, to allow those traditional organizations to mobilize these citizens, maybe allow those traditional organizations to have a better sense of what citizens' preferences are, what their needs are, and where their energies are. We saw this kind of dynamic at work in both the 2008 and 2012 Obama campaigns in full force in very different ways. One example that's very interesting is happened in 2011. Was a tiff between the Susan G. Komen Foundation. Some of you may have heard of. They sponsor walks. They're most famous for sponsoring walks to raise money for research around women's health issues, and especially breast cancer. And in 2011, the Susan G. Komen board voted to defund Planned Parenthood, of which they were a fairly significant funder. Immediately after that, Planned Parenthood, the organization tweeted out, Susan G. Komen caves under anti-choice pressure, ends funding for breast cancer screenings at PP health centers, tweeted that out, and within 3 days, they'd received $3 million, 100,000 Facebook likes, and kind of created a wildfire social media campaign that mobilized many, I have to believe, many, many more people than could have been mobilized in that short amount of time absent digital technology. It was really a viral engagement. By February 3rd, right, the tweet happened on January 31st. By February 3rd, 4 days later, the Susan G. Komen Foundation reversed its decision. By February 7th, the Susan G. Komen Foundation board member favoring the PP defunding decision resigns, and in the subsequent weeks, many members of the governing board and the executive director resigned. Right? So this is an example of how ICT enables traditional organizations, in this case Planned Parenthood, to really mobilize tons of supporters around an agenda that really caught wildfire. And I call this kind of dynamic viral engagement. And we saw a lot of that with the Kony 2012 video. I think Trayvon Martin is a case of viral engagement, all of the outrage and street protests around Trayvon. And then also a smaller, or no, a big case, but one that's kind of more wonky, is the digital mobilizations around PIPA SOPA, the Stop Online Piracy, Protect Intellectual Property Acts from a couple of years ago. All of those are cases in which digital technology enabled traditional organizations to mobilize millions and millions of people, and almost all of those cases turn around some policy decisions, sometimes social actions, in a very short amount of time, in a week or two, right? Very brief episodes. Now, some take-home messages from these six models. Remember, 3 models that a bunch of people do use that I think aren't very promising as ways to think about technology and politics. 3 models that have a little more promise. Some take-home messages. The first take-home message is that not everyone is coming in the Clay Shirky sense of technology enabling everybody to be a political actor, but professionals and organizations are leading that charge. The second message is that ICTs do not displace traditional media, but the right way to think about it is ICTs enable a different interaction of data and people and audiences with traditional media. And similarly, analogously, ICTs don't enable people really to go around or undermine traditional organizations like NGOs and advocacy groups and even public agencies, but they establish a differently mediated relationship between them. For those of you interested in developing startups that will push, technology startups that will push democracy forward, I think the winning cases, if you think about them, are cases in which a bunch of the contextual pieces are in place. Like they aren't in place in Egypt, and a big part of the jigsaw puzzle out here that's not put together is high levels of internet penetration, right? And that piece is in place in the United States, in part in place in China, not in place in Egypt. There are a bunch of pieces of context that have to be in place before getting the technology right is the last piece of the puzzle that will enable a substantial move forward. So it's probably more important to think about the whole context, or as important to think about the whole context as it is to think about the technology platform piece, right? Technology doesn't change this fundamental fact about politics observed by Max Weber in 1919. Politics is still the strong and slow boring of hard boards. It's the wrong picture of digital technology to think of transforming the old political technology of a hand drill to some kind of magical Dr. Seuss machine in which everyone's equal and good things top out. That's the wrong way to think about technology and politics and democracy. However, this is the optimistic part. I think that properly conceived and applied in the right context, technology can be a little bit more like a hand drill. And the thing about a hand drill is a power drill is much better than a hand drill, but it still requires a good carpenter, a good architect to know what a right angle is, to put the pieces together, to come up with a design that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, so the floor is open for comments and questions. I think what was important, even though we covered a lot of ground, the very common theme is the context and institutions matter. And I think that was clear from Tarek talking about Egypt. I think it's certainly clear in the case of China, where a sense of incidents can be raised, they can be reversed, but without alternative structures of organization, it's extremely difficult to be able to challenge a very powerful authority. And in fact, what I see happening there is the party has begun to understand and how to work with new technologies. In many ways, I think it's reinforcing its power and its capabilities against a potential emergent civil society. But please, yes, gentleman here. And maybe just let us know who you are.
Pat McCormick in 2005, mid-career, and spent some time in the U.S. more recently, a few years in Australia working on some related stuff. So my question is, if we think about these different examples, these different countries, and we think about the part of what hasn't worked, but the potential being about an open internet, peer-to-peer, flat, open access. And certainly in China, we have issues around censorship and monitoring. And in Egypt, in addition to the access or penetration, we have, I think there was blackouts in Egypt, like other countries in the Middle East, kill switch. And now in the U.S., we have net neutrality up for debate. And I wonder, what you each or some of you think about the potentially shifting nature of the internet, or the ability to have power over internet neighborhoods based on nations or otherwise, as impacting what you see as a potential.
Do you want to start?
Sure. I think that's a huge kind of question. I guess my own view is that I don't quite know how to think about the big architectural claims, like many people think that net neutrality is critically important for the quality of democracy to maintain an open internet. In some ways, that's too big of a claim for me to kind of parse, because I think of things much more in terms of specific examples and reason up from there. I think in terms of viral engagements like Trayvon Martin and Susan G. Komen and stuff, I think they're good for democracy insofar as they allow organizations and even individuals in the Trayvon case to tap into some resonant values that are out there and important, but not yet kind of in the political system and institutions. Tap into an authenticity in the population that's not yet in the political system, right? And I think that the closures of the internet will be bad for democracy to the extent that they're bad for that dynamic. And so I think some of the big kind of wildfire civic engagements or viral engagements that we've seen so far turn into wildfire because they're authentic, because they authentically tap into what really resonates with people and get big that way. Now, there's a lot of people investing a lot of money in trying to figure out how to manufacture viral engagement, how to manipulate it. In the Chinese case, right, with thousands of more than thousands of paid commenters. In the US case, with clever marketers of different kinds. And so if money solves that problem, I think that will be very bad for democracy, because what's good about these viral engagements is they tip the balance in favor of people and against money.
I think it's really important when you talk about tapping into moral sentiment, because I think if you think about, certainly in China, the issues which have really taken off are in some ways where they reinforce the values propagated by the regime. You know, they're against corruption, they're against malfeasance.
Yeah.
Then, of course, the regime gets worried because does it lose control? Does it move beyond their capabilities into something that they then can't control? And so I think that's one interesting dynamic of it. Then I think what seems to come out of what we've been saying, in a way, is it doesn't seem to build that systemic resistance because it doesn't have anything else to graft onto. So in a way, the party is still controlling the moral agenda of what you can be outraged about and what you cannot be outraged about. And then it could switch off. You know, it does turn things off. I mean, it censors terms, it takes things out. The other thing, which of course is the other debate in a number of countries, is about protocols. And can you set up essentially protocols that firewall your own country? And I think one of the things that's been remarkable about China to date is, given that it is such a high censorship environment, it has remained extraordinarily open, despite everything. Now, of course, Facebook is banned and Google and so on and so forth. But so it's got this dilemma between wanting what it sees as the economic engagement of fast information flows and how it balances that, you know, with the political control and censorship. And in a way that mirrors the bigger issue it's grappling with. How much do you free up the economy domestically, not anything related to internet, and how do you keep the political control over that? So you almost see that mirrored and play through the dynamics of the internet environment. So I think it goes back to the point you made, Archon, that all of this is dependent on the organization. And what Tarek, I thought, said very clearly, you know, you don't trump the mosque and the military. And in China, you have massive internet penetration. 600, 700 million people, whatever.
If I would just add one sentence to what both Tony and Archon have said, is that you can't count out the state, right? So what you I think pointed to the existence of things like kill switches. Tony pointed to the state's ability to acquire technologies to allow them to censor things. In April of 2011, after Mubarak had been overthrown, there was a much reported on incident where young revolutionaries, after Mubarak had been overthrown, managed to breach the walls of the Ministry of the Interior and go in and actually take their own files out. In fact, there was a whole file written about an article that I had written. But if you look at the photographs from that incident where they breached the office of the Ministry of the Interior, you see in one security official's office these plaques on the wall. And they're like certificates of completion, like you would have gotten if you'd done like an exec ed at the Kennedy School. And they're all from technology companies. And there's one, I wish I could remember the name. I will go back and look at this. There's one I actually Googled it, and it turns out it's a firm that specializes in sort of, eavesdropping on communication and things like that. So the point point is, the state, I think, particularly in these places, is always gonna have technologies for monitoring, surveilling, and even thwarting collective action that is, if it's solely online.
So, you know, in this space, it's common to think, there's a term that people who study technology use called technological determinism. And the slide with the, from the AAAS talk that Tara showed of George H.W. Bush is a technologically deterministic view in that it says, if you get technology X, Y result will happen. If you get a fax machine, get the internet, there will be more democracy, right? I think all three of us are unified in that we're not technological determinists, right? What the technology does just depends on a lot of different things, and especially what governments and other organizations do. And then to loop back to your question, I think that raises a policy issue, an important policy issue with respect to large internet utilities like Google and Facebook, right? And so if you right now today ask the board or CEOs of Google and Facebook, look, we have 100% confidence that if you changed your business in this way, it would make democracy better. I think for most of those cases, they would say, no, it's not our business to make democracy better. It's our business to run an internet company where private corporation responsibilities to shareholders, not to the American public as such, right? But to the extent that the internet, as we use it, is not an open internet, but several large companies, you know, half a dozen large companies, then I think they become more like utilities and they have to take on some of this responsibility for the quality of democracy, for privacy, for many other things.
Where governments need to take on responsibility for regulating.
Yeah, both.
Yeah, Murdoch certainly made his match in China.
Yeah.
Yes, John.
Yeah, you're commenting from.
So if you just let us know.
I'm sorry.
Let us know, yeah, John. Yeah.
John Ingleton, graduate of the other place on that side of the river. You're commenting about the system from the capability within to control it. One of the issues that looked at from outside the United States, we see in Europe, is the consequence of someone within the system, Snowden, leaking massive amounts of information and therefore bringing about between Germany and the United States the biggest argument they've had in the entire period since World War II. To what extent is there a risk where you've got this strong control within China, within Egypt, that someone tasked to keep things inside will actually do a Snowden?
Well, there are many Snowdens every day. There's something called China Digital Times, which is run by somebody who left China after 1989. And he basically, I know who sends them, but every directive that goes out saying, do not report on the Wenzhou train crash, he somehow gets them. And he puts them all up online. So it's unbelievable. If you go there every day, there is just a continual sea of internal directives saying, don't comment on this, you must never comment on that. There's never been that kind of bulk, regime-threatening, huge block, which might have something so detrimental in the way that the things were related to Angela Merkel, for example. But that, despite everything I said, that system just leaks. And, it's true believers. Maybe some people are doing it for money. I don't know. But, the point I made before is that in the Chinese system, information really is power. And it's secrets that are traded for information. And everything is categorized. And there's a hierarchy. So there is a fee for it. And so people will pay for that kind of information and leak. I know it's not the same as the Snowden case, but it is a leaky system, I don't know, with respect to Egypt.
Yeah, I mean, I think, that is such an extraordinary question, and it never even occurred to me. And so I was trying to think, why do I think it would be so impossible to observe a Snowden in the Egyptian case? And the only answer I can give you is that even in the American case, right, Snowden is one guy. I mean, we don't have a lot of examples of Snowdens, even though we have lots of opportunity for Snowden, right? So it's a kind of 1 in a million thing to get somebody who is willing to take that big a risk to expose that big a thing. In the Egyptian case, I mean, I don't know. I think Snowden is a kind of probably a conspiratorial-minded person, so he probably thinks that, if he probably correctly or even overestimated the personal risk to himself by revealing this. In the Egyptian case, an accurate assessment of the risk to a Snowden would be death. And so I think that's instantaneous death. And maybe Snowden, but it's a fantastic question because these states are incompetent.
Yeah.
And yet they're very competent at keeping their secrets. And I wonder, why is that?
That's a great question.
Yes, as a gentleman.
Hey, just a question on.
Sorry, just let everyone know.
Yes, Chris Tanian, mid-career class of 2013. So this question has to do more with American politics and the internet. And the idea, I sort of agree that Clay Shirky's, example of his book, which I did read, was very entertaining, but maybe an exaggeration of the internet making some dramatic changes. But when you think about the impact of how the internet has changed politics in this country, as far as enabling, you could think of institutions in the past being able to filter out, like the moment, some of the authentic emotions of the moment. Like say the Tea Party, for example, where you have this real emotion coming out of 2009, 2008, anti-government, where in the past, I think the parties could have probably tempered some of that emotion. The institutions were kind of bypassed in that case, where candidates were able to raise money and kind of bypass institutions such as the Republican Party and actually destabilize the government in some ways, where they got these candidates into power that might never would have in the past, and had a, whether it was shutting down the government or threatening to shut down the government, really has a dramatic impact.
Right, so that raises a big kind of question that I don't really know the answer to, that's relevant certainly to Egypt, and I don't know about China. So one hypothesis out there that seems pretty reasonable to me is formulated first by my colleague friend Marshall Gans. And so his hypothesis is that what digital technology has done is made mobilization too cheap, right? So during the civil rights era and before, if you wanted to mobilize 1 million people, you had to build organizations and develop leaders, and that was hard, right? Took a long time to do that, took a lot of sweat equity in there, and as a result, whenever you mobilize a lot of people, it's really connected to organizations and leaders that can do stuff, in particular strategize and do deals and so on. And it seems like you could think that one of the things that digital technology has done is made it easy to mobilize people by the million or tens of millions without paying that cost of organization, right? And so you see that with Occupy, you see that maybe with the Tea Party, maybe with the Arab Spring, with some of these viral engagements. So you mobilize lots of people, but then what happens after that, right? It becomes very difficult to sustain, even to organize, even to turn something constructive into. And so, is that three things, is that hypothesis correct? If it's correct, what do you do with it? Is there some way to translate? Another person in this conversation said, well, that's the problem of moments and movements. How do you translate a moment into a movement? And then later on I was thinking, maybe this isn't just about technology. Like if you just think about the history of the United States, there have been moments of kind of more spontaneous, disorganized populism that has dark edges and fringes to it for sure. And so how do we think about, did they just go away, or did they eventually get organized and incorporated and become more constructive, or what? But I think it's a fascinating set of questions that I certainly don't have the answer to.
Any other comments or questions? Yes, Arif?
My name is Arif, and I'm a graduating MBA student from Kennedy School. So, just taking this kind of international, we see like a lot of organizations, including like Move On and Awaz, and like Awaz was running a campaign on Egypt, the sentencing of 400 something Muslim Brotherhood members to death. So they're running a campaign. I think it's still on. So, do you think that is there actually? I mean, after listening to this, actually, I have some doubts about the whole model of doing it. Like within a country which has a democratic government, it's so difficult to do anything. But doing it on an international scale, like trying to put pressure on Egyptian leadership in the present conditions, sitting in, not just in US, it's an international campaign, they have managed to come up with like 2 million signatures or something, and the way they go. But do you think, like, do you see any value in that kind of campaigning? They do, I mean, like Abbas, Move On, they do like offline, online. So what, for in case of News Corp in London, they held like demonstration in front of the parliament, and they created a lot of noise. But then in contexts like Egypt or say Jordan, or do you see any value of this kind of online mobilization internationally?
I mean, my take on it really relates to the kinds of issues we've raised already, and I leave Tarek to talk specifically about the Middle East. But you know, I think it goes back to what we're talking, where there maybe are pre-existing organizations, it maybe move things more speedily in the way that Marshall is talking about. But the question is, does it really graft if there's not a receptive vehicle that can really take those and mobilize those views over time? And I think if you look at traditional transnational civil society and organizing, usually where it works best is where the transnational organization is able to reach in behind the territorial boundaries and grasp or graft onto some kind of institution or organization within that country. So I was thinking, for example, of some of the debates which have gone on about the cross-river border flows in the Mekong. Those campaigns which have been successful, or the anti-logging campaigns, yes, they were transnational movements, but in each of the instances where it's successful, there was a domestic organization at work as well. And that sort of lifted over and carried information into there, hooked them into a bigger community, which then brought pressure onto the government, you know, both from within the country and externally. And then you have all the kinds of issues of international shaming and so on and so forth that you can bring in. So I don't have an exact answer, but my suspicion is we're sort of going back to an international version of what we were talking about here. But Tarek, in the Middle East, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know. I mean, I guess your question is, can these transnational advocacy campaigns that have a significant online component change the behavior of governments that think it's a good idea to sentence 539 people to death in the span of a day? I think the answer to that is trivially no. But those advocacy campaigns could influence the government of the United States, which has its own limited but nonetheless real sources of leverage with governments like Egypt. And so they're not meaningless.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's two different parts to your question, which the part that Tony and Tarek just addressed is articulated, the best articulation of this dynamic that I know of is my colleague at the Kennedy School, a great place, Catherine Sicking, in her earlier book, Activists Beyond Borders. And so she says, look at all these this is way before the internet got big. Right, you look at in developing countries, labor movements, environmental movements, human rights movements, and they succeed because of what she calls a boomerang effect. And it's exactly what Tony said, right? So there's some domestic labor movement, the government just totally doesn't want to hear it. They can't get any purchase, so their domestic channels of access are blocked. But then they go outside and form alliances with transnational organizations that put some top-down pressure on that government that's recalcitrant. Sometimes it's government to government, sometimes it's IGO to government, sometimes it's popular movement like Amnesty to government, right? And then maybe through that boomerang effect, sometimes they break through and get victories for environment or human rights or labor rights or whatever it is. And so I think what you're talking about is an internet version of that. And then the question is it a real boomerang? And how powerful is that boomerang, right? Now, a different issue about Avaaz and Move On is that they have fundamentally changed the structure of what advocacy looks like, right? And so, colleague in the government department, Theda Skocpol, was about 10 years ago was lamenting the transformation of advocacy groups in the United States, but I think this is true elsewhere as well, in that they're heads without bodies. That is, you know, you get a few lawyers in Washington who do direct mail campaigns and raise a bunch of money so that they can conduct their lobbying, but there's no real membership there, right? No engaged membership that's having meetings and talking about it. And so that's like the thinned out advocacy group. What the internet did and what Move On did especially Joan Blades and Eli Pariser, is turn that model on its head, right? And so Move On has no real strategic capability as such by design, right? They pursue campaigns that are popular with their members. It's by design a plebiscitarian organization that raises huge amounts of money and therefore well-funded campaigns. And David Karp, guy who looks at digital organizing, says, well, at least in the United States, every organization that has been founded since Move On has adopted Move On's model in this advocacy space because it's such a financially great model, right? Is it good for politics? Yes and no, right? I mean, it would be better to have an organization with some strategy that was somewhere in between. I don't really like the, the heads without bodies model, but this one has a lot of critiques that you could make of it as well.
Any other comments or questions? Tired everyone out? Anyway, thank you all for being part of the